Previously on Retronet. Now it's time for me to subject myself to slow computer hell for the next 7 days. This will be fun, right? Hey guys, so quick update. It was not fun. It was very not fun. To put into perspective how not fun it was, Justin said he'd finance the rest of this video if I used it to make an ad for the shop, and it's still rendering. So I guess we'll check in on that later. Anyway, yeah, I gave myself the challenge of using this 2001 Power Mac G4 for a week, and that sounds ridiculous, and it is. So I made some rules. So I know that being able to use this computer for everything is extremely unlikely, to say the least. So the first rule is that everything at the very least is going to be attempted on this machine. If it absolutely can't be done and needs to be done, I'll do it on another machine. Fitting in with that statement, if things can only be done within certain boundaries, for example, video editing but only in standard definition, they will be done within these restrictions. And you will soon see there are a lot of restrictions. Now, it wouldn't be much fun if I only tried to do what I know this computer can do, which is almost nothing, to be honest. So I'm showing no mercy. I'm going to run this thing through its paces. Those paces being general use, music production, art and design, gaming, and video editing. These are all things I do on a regular basis, so I need to do them here. Will I be able to? I guess we're about to find out. Day one started about as well as you'd expect. And by that I mean it didn't. The computer wouldn't turn on. And to be honest, this wasn't a surprise. These machines, especially at this age, are known to have relatively flaky power supplies. There's a project that has instructions on how to adapt regular ATX power supplies into these machines, because Apple had to be special and use proprietary wiring configurations to support ADC. And I actually tried doing that the first time this happened. It didn't work, but for some reason when I put the original power supply back in, it just magically turned on again. Regardless, this wasn't the first time this had happened, and it probably wouldn't be the last. After basically just waiting around for half the day until the thing decided to turn on and rebooting several times, I finally managed to boot into OS X Tiger. Browsing the modern internet on a 20-something-year-old computer is interesting. Mainly because it doesn't work very well. Most modern websites are just chock full of lovely ads and superfluous scripts and trackers that the average user won't notice because most of the time, their computer is strong enough to handle them. This computer is not that. Loading anything that wasn't a pretty basic, low-resource website slowed things down to a crawl. Not to say that there aren't new websites you can browse on here. Macintosh Garden is fine. Stack Overflow took a while to load but was usable at the very least. It's just that anything with that new Web3 coat of paint on it is just not happening on this computer. Unless maybe you use the old web or something like that, but still. I use two browsers on here, Interweb PPC for OS X and Classilla for OS IX. Interweb is a spin-off of the popular 10.4 browser for PowerPC computers that was discontinued a couple years ago. It does a pretty good job and has different builds that are optimized for the different generations of PowerPC processors. There's also another spin-off browser called AquaWeb Micro, which is a much more pared-down version of Interweb. I gave it a try, but found it just a bit too limited in what it could do. On the OS IX front, I use the trusty Classzilla, which has sadly also been discontinued, although I don't know of many people besides myself who are actively trying to use OS IX to run their Twitter machine. Using this, and other programs as I would come to find out, made me realize that this computer is much better at doing OS IX things than OS X things. The computer runs a lot smoother without all the extra graphical gloss that Tiger brings to the table. Classilla is no exception, when it finds a site that it can actually access. Yeah, the other problem with trying to get online with a machine this old is the incredibly outdated security protocols that are the most they can support. Interweb can access some of these newer sites as it's based off a much more modern extended service release of Firefox, but Classilla isn't as capable. The newest form of internet security that it can handle is TLS 1.2, which many sites have been phasing out in the past little while. You can use something like CryptoNCN to make a proxy that Classilla can use to access these sites using the current TLS 1.3 protocol, but my network setup is a mess that I do not want to deal with, so I decided to just cut my losses. In the end, can it browse the web? Yes. Can it do it well? No. God, no. Really? The next thing I wanted to try on here was attempting to communicate to the outside world. This wouldn't really make for a good daily rig if I couldn't send silly little messages to my silly little friends. My messaging app of choice is Discord. Love it or hate it, it works for me. Now obviously there's no official build of Discord that supports the PowerPC architecture, at least not to my knowledge, so I'd need to go the third-party route. My first option was DOSDude1's Discord Lite, a lightweight Discord client made to run on modern and vintage Mac computers. This seemed like it'd work great. It supported almost every Discord feature I use on a daily basis, like attachments, images, etc. It seemed like everything I'd need.
Alert. Optimism levels have reached threshold. Please refrain from positive thinking until levels have reached an acceptable resting point.
So reality kicked in as it always does, and our SSL woes continued. Discord recently dropped support for TLS 1.1 and older, which means this app is now basically useless on old versions of macOS unless you have some sort of SOCKS proxy to pass through the HTTPS traffic. Hey, so quick side note, as of the editing of this video and this section, DOSDude has released a new build of Discord Lite that adds TLS 1.3 support. So basically everything you're about to hear isn't really applicable anymore. It should work. So, yeah. I tried to get this working. I tried to set up a proxy on my actual computer, didn't work. I tried to use a public HTTPS proxy, didn't work. Attempted witchcraft, also didn't work. Unfortunately, I had to ditch this one, which really sucks because I wanted to see it working. But alas, there were other options to move on to. The second one is a much more rudimentary option. It's called Discross. It's a relay client that allows Discord messages to be sent and viewed in pretty much any browser that can display an HTML page. Michael MJD recently did a video on this demonstrating it running on a Wii, so I think my chances here are pretty good. And they were. It was relatively painless to set up, and it did what it said it'd do. However, what it said it can do is pretty limited. No images, no attachments, messages only. Which is fine, I guess. The main drawback is that you can only communicate to servers that have this bot added. In my situation, this meant that I could pretty much only communicate to the one server I was able to add bots to. These things pretty much limit Discross to more of a novelty in my opinion than an actual solution. It's cool, but it's not what I'm looking for.
Optimism levels have returned to an acceptable amount.
Why do we even have this? When did this get installed? At this point, I was kind of running out of ideas. It was until I remembered something I did when I got my iMac G3. See, I was thinking too big. I needed to put myself in the time period that this computer existed in. What did people in 2001 use to communicate over the internet? That's when 3 big letters appeared in front of me. No, not those letters. Different ones. I'm talking IRC, baby. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, as I'm sure many people born within the last 10 to 15 years do, IRC stands for Internet Relay Chat. It's one of the OG ways to chat on the web dating all the way back to the late 80s. Without going too in-depth, you use IRC to talk in channels on the hosting server. It's text only. Technically, you can send and request files, but that's not in the scope of this video. Technicalities aside, that's it. Text chat room. So why would I bother with such a thing in this day and age? Especially if the previous option was too limited? That's because IRC does what it does well. And I think it's neat. Now, how do we bring Discord into this? Well, some of the kind users over at the Macintosh Garden have devised what they call an IM gateway, allowing pretty much any device that supports Jabber or IRC protocols to send and receive messages from modern platforms like Discord and Facebook Messenger. Besides this basically being a miracle in itself, it works surprisingly well. It is a bit of a hassle to get set up, I won't lie. It's also a bit unwieldy in the way that you have to basically assign individually numbered Discord server channels to their own fake IRC channels. But something about using an IRC client to talk to an actual modern and living online community is just plain cool. So with that working, I can finally give the communication section a pass. Our last test of the first day is Multimedia. What do people like to do more on their computers than waste away in their chairs watching YouTube videos? But not like, not you. You're not wasting anything, you're learning. Yeah, learning. Well, if mindlessly scrolling through YouTube's recommended feed is your cup of tea, then sadly this is not the computer for you. Obviously, for reasons previously stated, YouTube runs like molasses on here, if it runs at all. The mobile site loads a bit better, but it's still pretty much unusable, so watching YouTube in the browser is not an option. Instead, we can try something like PowerPC Media Center. This is kind of an all-in-one solution for downloading, converting, and playing back videos from the internet on old, underpowered machines like mine. Once again, seems cool. If it worked. I didn't think I'd have to jump through that many hoops to play a 480p YouTube video on this computer, but I did. For one, PPCMC's implementation of YouTube DL didn't work out of the box as it now requires Python 3.7 or newer. The workaround for this is to 1. Install Xcode, 2. Install the unofficial 10.4 toolkit, 3. Take the Mac-ported version of Python 3.10 that comes with this toolkit and use it to replace the Python 3.6 binary in the PPCMC's package contents. Only then can you get YouTube DL to successfully update and install. The next pitfall of using PPCMC to watch YouTube videos is that you still have to go on YouTube to find the videos, which kinda defeats the purpose. PPCMC can only download YouTube videos from links, so unless you have a really good memory and know the exact URL of the video you want to watch, you are going to be sitting in silence waiting for YouTube's search to load metal pipe falling sound effect high quality so you can get the link. And after all that, lag city, baby, 1 whole frame per second. Maybe 2 seconds.
Bad.
Yeah, so even after downloading the video in relatively low quality, I still needed to convert it for QuickTime 6 for it to play at anything resembling an acceptable frame rate. After that, played fine. But honestly, if you want to watch anything on here, just watch a DVD. It does that fine. It can play movie. So that wraps up day 1. How did our general use fare? Not particularly well, to be quite honest. Does this surprise me? No. It still sucks, though. All in all, my rating for this would be inconclusive, all things considered. It can technically do most of the things I tried doing on it, but not to an extent that I'd call useful. So in case you didn't know, I also make music. Shameless promotion, go listen, go do it. Doing things like music production and mixing are tasks I do on a relatively regular basis, so I figured I'd add them as part of this challenge. The thing about that is the process of making music and whether or not you can or can't do it is pretty subjective. Let's start simple. When it comes to making something like tracker music, of course the G4 has no problem. But you can run tracker software on pretty much anything. Like Game Boy anything. Granted, trackers are a pretty broad way to make music in themselves, with a lot of different programs with the same basic layout but vastly differing features and capabilities. My tracker software of choice for old PowerPC Macs is Player Pro. I won't lie, the software is a little weird to get used to in terms of layout and shortcuts, but it works. If it's good enough for Aphex Twin, it's good enough for anyone. I actually used this software a few times here and on my iMac G3 to sequence old school breakbeats for some songs. I most recently used it in this remix I made for Duvet by Boa. Yet another shameless plug, go listen. So yeah, tracker software gets the pass. Not a huge challenge, but still, credit where credit's due. But how about we see if it can handle something a bit heavier? When I mix a track, I usually do so in Pro Tools with the stems bounced from another DAW. So I thought, hey, why don't I take some stems that I've been meaning to mix on my actual rig and see if I can mix them here? You know how they say there's no such thing as a stupid question? They're f***ing liars. Making my already lengthy list of questionable decisions even longer, I decided to mix a full 3.5-minute track on an absolutely ancient version of Pro Tools that is compatible with my G4 and M-Box audio interface. The task of finding a version of Pro Tools that worked on my setup was a monumental task in itself.
What does that mean?
I thought it would be as easy as making sure that I had the drivers for my interface and just downloading a G4 compatible version of Pro Tools. It was not that easy, of course. It's never that easy. Have you watched any of these videos? Did you watch the past, 10 minutes of video? Anyway, there's 3 main versions of Pro Tools from this era, and they're all built differently to support certain pieces of hardware that they came with. After hunting high and low for some crumb of anything that would lead to the version of Pro Tools that would actually work with my M-Box, I finally stumbled upon the Mac OS 9 Libs forums. And it just so happens that a lot of people here are using old PowerPC Macs running OS 9 in their home music studios. How convenient! From here, I was able to find a bunch of helpful things, including the original version of Pro Tools that came with my interface. So, after this lengthy search, all I had to do now was actually mix the track. This is where I encountered my first and main roadblock. This version of Pro Tools can only support up to 13 tracks max. Now, depending on what you're mixing, that might not be a problem. In my case, the track I chose to mix consisted of almost 60 individual stems. 60 different tracks! How the absolute hell was I going to manage this, you may be asking? Well, my dear viewer, I had to once again think old school. How did they used to get past track limitations? Bouncing. Lots and lots of bouncing. Basically, my process on this setup consisted of me mixing individual buses or related sets of tracks on their own, and then recording or bouncing them down to their own submixes. From there, you'd mix the submixes together into a final track. Simple enough, right? Hell was actually a better time, I think. Yeah, so even though this process could be done, it was incredibly time-consuming and frustrating. Besides the bouncing, Pro Tools could handle a couple simple plugins per track, EQs and compressors and all that, just not too many at a time. Now, if you had a better piece of hardware like one of DigiDesign's old rack units like the Digi 001 or 003, you'd be able to use a version of Pro Tools made for them with hardware optimization and support for more tracks and plugins. But alas, I do not own those. I do not have space for those. I don't even have space for this! But that's besides the point. Pro Tools mixing gets the pass. A weird thing happened though is that I couldn't actually play the track back that I exported on the G4. It kept trying to open in Pro Tools, which obviously didn't result in anything because it wasn't a project file. I tried QuickTime, nothing. I tried mPlay, nothing. I tried a version of Winamp for Mac, nothing. I even tried f***ing Windows Media Player 7, and all that did was hang the computer during the install. Anyway, it played back afterwards on my actual rig, so I'll still count it. In a surprising turn of events, I finally caught a break. Day 3's test was image editing, which ended up being relatively painless. I do some design and things in my spare time too, so I decided to see if this machine could handle some Photoshop. CS2 to be specific. I put together a little collage thing with some pictures I took on an old Sony Digicam I have. The images obviously weren't crazy high res, but they were still relatively large, and this machine handled them with little to no issue. I had quite a few layers going on here, all with overlapping bits and different blending modes and masks, but aside from a few hiccups and visual lag here and there, I didn't really have any problems doing this. Aside from this little collage, I also used this computer to design some cover art for a single I put out at the end of last year. This one was definitely a bit more involved, but aside from taking longer than it would on a modern machine, it did the job, so the image editing test gets a pass. Alright, our little break from torment has ceased. We are now back on the pain train. Now personally, I don't game as much as I used to. I'd like to, but I just never seem to have the time. But of course, gaming is a part of daily life for many, so I felt I should probably give it a try. Obviously, I'm not going to be running any AAA titles on here, or at least not modern ones, so let's continue our various homages to Druaga by trying to run Halo CE on here. I'm getting a little bit of deja vu, I don't know about you. Anyways, after completely ignoring signs of the apocalypse to come like usual, the game opened, and actually seemed to be working. Just very slowly. Like, really slow. I wouldn't say it's slow enough to be completely unplayable, but it definitely chugs when there's anything more than like 2 enemies on screen. I tried dropping the settings, but it didn't really help much. Regardless, I made it past the opening mission, so it gets a pass. Now onto something slightly more period correct, or at least spec correct. Unreal Tournament. This classic shooter plays fine under Mac OS 9 with relatively decent settings as well. I didn't want to push things too far, but with high settings at 1024 by 768, everything ran smoothly. One thing to note is that the Apple Pro Mouse, not a good choice for gaming. Honestly, not a good choice for anything. It's one button. But why? Like why? What does that accomplish? Anyway, Unreal gets the pass. Finally, a game that can run on a machine like 10 years older than this one. Sam & Max Hit the Road runs without a hitch. I did have to burn it to a CD for the audio to work properly, but other than that, the G4 is fine for enjoying everyone's favorite crime-fighting dog and lagomorph duo. So yeah, the G4 can play games. Not heavy ones, but games nonetheless. I mean, if I was stuck on an island with only this computer, and these 3 games, well, I'd be kind of confused mainly. Why is this computer on an island with me? There's no electricity here. How would this even work? How did I get here? Yeah, so I'm not a numbers guy, but I just kind of figured this is something I should do. I'm not sure why I waited this far into the week to do it, but oh well. Continuing on in OS 9, I ran good old MacBench. This computer ran like molasses the whole week, which was mostly to be expected, but something felt a little off. Like it was running too slow. So maybe some benchmarks would show me where the faults were. The default baseline that MacBench compares to is a 300 MHz G3, which obviously this computer outperforms. By about double, actually. I thought that the step up between generations would help it along a little more, but this is a relatively low clock G4, so that checks out. The disk performance was insanely fast, no doubt as a result of our SSD upgrade. I also ran Cinebench 2003, which performed about as well as I did during my 3rd grade school Christmas concert. Yeah, this thing got like max 3 frames per second on the OpenGL test, and the CPU test took a whopping 8.5 minutes to complete. Granted, this version of Cinebench is a good few years newer than this machine, but still, these results are abysmal. So what was the issue? Our CPU is slow, but not insanely slow for the time. Our disk speeds are crazy good, so the bottleneck isn't there. And we saw from our gaming test that the GPU has at least some juice to get things going. Let's boot into OS 10 and run one more benchmark to see if we can get an answer. Or maybe let's not do that. Yeah, so for some reason at this point, I just couldn't get the computer to boot back into OS 10. This wasn't an uncommon occurrence, but I could usually get past it with a couple restarts. But this time, that just didn't work. So I unplugged it for a second to give it a clean start. And I couldn't turn it back on for like 2 days. So judging by that, I'd say it's relatively safe to say that it's likely the power that's the issue here. Maybe the components aren't getting enough of it. Honestly, at this point, I'm just trying to get through this. I've been suffering for a week. Just let me boot in OS 10, thank you. Okay, last benchmark, Xbench. The scores suck. It scored 19.19 overall. You can see the rest of the results here, but yeah. Honestly, Tiger isn't really the best fit for this computer, so that might be a factor here. Maybe Panther would work better. But honestly, I'd just stick with OS 9. I really wanted to call it quits here, but I realized there was still one thing I hadn't done yet. As I said at the start of this video, through some sort of miracle, I was able to edit a video on this computer. This was, of course, another uphill battle. I could have probably ran iMovie on here and called it a day, but that wouldn't be very fun, and as you know, I have to do everything the hard way. So I decided to use a more professional video editor. It was between Premiere and Final Cut, and since Premiere hung the computer anytime I tried to play video and refused to open on OS 10, Final Cut it would be. Now, this should work. Should work. Apple software, Apple computer, requirements met, etc. Everything was in its right place. And it seemed like it was at first. Final Cut 4 opened relatively painlessly under Tiger, and I was able to drag things in. Then I tried to save and it crashed, and wouldn't open. So I decided to try Final Cut Pro 2 in OS 9, which I once again could get open and drag things into. It is at this point that I should note that I have never used Final Cut. I'm a Premiere man, against my own will. So when I tried to drag in my voiceover audio and only heard beeping, I was very confused. I soon discovered that it's because these old versions of Final Cut require pretty much anything that isn't an AIFF file to be rendered prior to pressing play. With that newfound knowledge, I once again was forced to return to a modern machine to convert the audio, and upon coming back to the G4, I found that I could no longer open Final Cut 2. I have no idea why. It just wouldn't open again. So back to OS 10 it was. I came this far, I wasn't walking out of this empty-handed. I finally managed to get Final Cut open again and began to edit. This led to the next problem, being that any sort of key combination involving the command key would crash Final Cut.
I just undoed. Oh.
That's right. Something as simple as Command-Z to undo, or even Command-S to save, would bring things to a screeching halt. Being a somewhat well-versed video editor and having to use a drop-down menu to save your project regularly is the equivalent to drinking from a water bottle that's been left out in a hot car. No, I will not elaborate. So, with this other obstacle noted, it was time to start editing. And several hours and accidental crashes later, I was finally making progress. I don't think it's an understatement to say that editing with this setup was a painful experience, to say the least. But after all was said and done, it was time to render. This ended up going surprisingly well. Plot conveniences aside, the video rendered at a surprisingly acceptable speed. It wasn't blazing fast, but it's not like it took days or anything. So finally, through sheer technicality and my unnecessary commitment to the bit, the G4 passes the editing test. Mostly. So here we are, at the end of the road. We can finally answer the question. Can you use a 20-something-year-old Power Mac G4 as your main computer? No. Why would you think the answer would be anything other than that? You fucking stupid or something? Insults aside, I genuinely did not think this would be as much of a pain as it actually was. Doing anything on this computer other than a few tasks took way more effort than it was worth. But I guess that's part of the fun. Trying to do today's tasks on something that wasn't meant to do so. Living in a time period you maybe didn't get to experience to the fullest. Filling in the blanks of the past by making new memories to fit. There's a chance I'd have better luck using something like a more modern Linux distro on here, and maybe I'll revisit that idea in the future. But right now I want nothing to do with this computer. I do not want to see it, I do not want to think about it. My nightmares are going to be made of aging translucent plastic for the foreseeable future. So this ends the current installment in my never-ending quest for self-fulfillment through the lens of nostalgia. I hope you all enjoyed watching me suffer. My therapist will be hearing about you all.
Sib, where the hell is that ad that you said you'd make? I told you to do it like a week ago. I'm not
You're not
paying
paying
you
me to sit around. I know. Christ, Justin. I know. Can I ever catch a fucking break in this hellhole?
Don't you dare
Please,
yell
would
at
you
me.
just let me? Can I
own
exist?
you.
Can I
I'm
exist
the one
in this
who writes
space?
your checks.
Is there any
I own you.
room? Is there any room in the
Honestly, how
budget
dare
for me to
you?
simply
You
just
come in
stand here
here
for longer
into
than 5
my
seconds without me
business.
having to do
My
something for you?
business,
Without you
and
asking
you're
me? What do you
yelling
even
at
do
me?
here?
Are you a purveyor of horrendously obsolete consumer electronics? Do you have 20-year-old computers that just aren't running up to snuff? More ThinkPads than you know what to do with? Did Cousin Johnny stick a cold cut sandwich in the VCR again? Well, come on down to Retronet Technical Solutions, where we can solve all your problems and more. If your electronics are giving you problems, bring them down to us. Our highly trained technicians will have your problem sorted out in no time. If we can't fix it, you don't pay. I have been informed that you do in fact still pay. Store policy, sorry. So come on down to Retronet Technical Solutions, your one-stop shop for all things old and irrelevant. Located at 537 Paper Street, Bradford 19808, serving free diagnostics for a limited time.